the leper's pit, cast among the diseased. In the shadow of medieval Christendom, where fear and faith walked hand in hand, no terror was more enduring than the slow corruption of the flesh that men called leprosy. It was not a swift death on the battlefield, nor the sudden collapse of plague, but a living unmaking, a body turned into its own tomb, a soul shunned while still breathing. The chronicles speak little of it beyond whispers, for lepers were not recorded like kings and bishops, but cast out, hidden, buried alive in pits of misery at the edge of the world. It is said that to look upon them too long was to glimpse the very rot of hell itself. The leper's journey began with a blemish, a pale patch on the skin, a numbness in the hand, a tingling that would not pass. The sufferer might go first to a priest, trembling, hoping it was but a fever or rash. Yet the priest would summon not a healer, but a cleric versed in ritual judgment. For in those years the disease was thought not merely a sickness, but a mark of sin, a punishment for hidden vice. A man would be stripped to his underclothes before the altar, candles flickering like the eyes of Christ, and his skin examined as if it were a parchment where God had written condemnation. If the signs were found, the ashen pallor, the clawing of fingers, the pale nodules spreading across the face, the bell of doom was rung. The leper was declared dead to the world of the living. Then came the ceremony of exile. Cloaked in black, the condemned knelt before the altar as the priest read the words of burial. Thou art dead to the world, though yet thou walkest within it. Thy flesh is but dust before its time, thy soul in peril of eternal flame. A handful of earth was sprinkled upon the head as if for a grave. The man or woman wept, or shrieked, or sat in stunned silence. But the rite allowed no protest. The community gathered, crossing themselves, averting their eyes. The leper's possessions were seized, his bed burned, his house marked and abandoned. His wife or children were forbidden to touch him again, and he was given only the garb of the outcast. A cloak with a hood, gloves to cover decaying hands, and a wooden clapper or bell to announce his coming, so that no healthy soul would be caught unawares. From that moment on, the leper was a ghost among men. No tavern would admit him, no church would allow him past the porch. He begged for crusts at the roadside, hiding in ditches as wagons passed. Mothers pulled children away, muttering prayers. Dogs snarled at the scent. The outcasts wandered in ragged groups, a procession of carrion walking, the air around them buzzing with flies. They were not executed by sword or flame, but left to dwindle, rotting by inches. Yet for many, there was no wandering, no begging. The towns and lords, weary of their presence, dug pits beyond the walls and herded the diseased into them. These pits were crude enclosures, sunken hollows dug into waste ground or abandoned quarries, with rough wooden stakes hemming them in. Some had broken roofs of thatch, others only the sky. Within, the lepers were left with a few loaves of coarse bread, a bucket of water, and the company of one another's suffering. These were called leper pits, though in truth they were open graves where the living rotted before death. The stench of such a place was said to roll across the fields for miles, a reek of sweat, pus, and decay so thick that travelers crossed themselves and quickened their pace. Crows circled above, swooping down to peck at scraps or corpses left unburied when the living grew too weak to dig. Rats tunneled in, gnawing at the toes of sleepers. The ground grew slick with bodily fluids, for the sores of leprosy oozed endlessly, a slow weeping of corruption. Skin turned pale and then dark, cracking open to reveal the yellow fat beneath. Fingers withered into claws, toes fell away, ears sloughed off. Faces collapsed as the cartilage of the nose melted, leaving cavernous holes where once had been breath and dignity. Yet more terrifying than the flesh was the slow erasure of self. A leper's mind remained sharp while the body decayed, forced to witness its own unmaking. Men who once swung swords could no longer lift a crust of bread. Women who once sang to children now croaked through ruined throats, their voices rasping like broken bells. The disease gnawed not only at the flesh but at the bonds of kinship and faith. For who could believe themselves beloved of God when cast into a pit, left to howl in the night with others marked for death? Some prayed still, clutching rotting rosaries with skeletal fingers. Others cursed, calling down vengeance on the priests who damned them, on the families who turned away. The chronicles record that some pits became places of madness. A man might tear at his own sores, laughing, smearing filth upon the walls. Another might claw the earth, digging tunnels with bloody stumps, whispering that he would crawl back into the town. At night, the cries rose like wolves, wails that echoed against the stones. Travelers heard them on the wind and spoke of hell's chorus leaking into the mortal world. Not all died swiftly. Some lingered for years, their bodies reduced to little more than husks, faces gnawed away until skull and flesh merged in a grotesque mask. The pit became their universe, its walls the edges of a shrinking world. The stronger picked through the corpses of the fallen, scavenging for clothing, gnawing marrow when bread failed. It was whispered that cannibalism was not unknown, though the priests denied it, for to admit such was to admit that men, abandoned by their fellows, became beasts. And yet bones were found cracked, marrow sucked dry, gnawed not by rat but by human teeth. The peasants feared the pits but also used them as lessons for their children. A father would point to the smoke rising from the waste ground and say, "Disobey God, and you will join them." A mother would hush a crying babe with whispers of the lepers who wandered at night, their bells tolling doom. For the greatest terror was not the sight of them, but the chance of becoming one. Any blemish, any sore, could be the first step into the pit. Thus men covered themselves, avoided touch, bathed in vinegar, clutched charms of saints, yet still lived in dread of the unseen hand of corruption. In some towns, the leper pits were visited by priests who stood outside the fence, holding high the host, bidding the outcasts kneel in the mud to receive communion upon long spoons. In others, they were left entirely alone, their only visitors the scavengers and the birds. And when death at last claimed them, their corpses were shoveled into trenches beside the pit, covered with a thin layer of earth, left to the worms. Few stones marked their passing. Few names endured. They became a nameless multitude, a warning written not in ink but in decay. It is told that in certain winters, when famine bit deep and plague swept the land, the leper pits grew quiet, emptied not by cure but by death. Then the townsfolk, emboldened, crept to the edges and peered within. They found bones scattered like kindling, skulls grinning through tangled hair, scraps of rotted cloth clinging to the earth. In one pit, a skeleton sat upright against the wall, fingers clawed into the soil, as if he had tried to climb out long after strength had fled. The air was foul even years later, the ground stained black where fluids had seeped. Men muttered prayers, sprinkled holy water, and fled, vowing never to look again. The pits were not always at the edge of wilderness. Some lay near roads so that travelers might see the outcasts and shudder. In this they served as a theater of punishment, not by whip or flame, but by sight alone. To behold the living dead was to be reminded of sin, of fragility, of the narrow line between health and damnation. The lepers themselves became sermons of flesh, preaching with their sores and stumps a message of terror, that God's justice could take any man, no matter his wealth or pride, and strip him down to a stinking ruin. Thus the memory of the pits endures not in the glory of chronicles, but in whispers. Farmers plowing fields unearthed bones with clawed fingers, skulls without noses, and shuddered, crossing themselves. Monks wrote of them in margins, half erased by candle smoke, ashamed to admit how their brothers in Christ had been buried alive. The leper pits were not prisons nor hospitals, but oubliettes of the living, graves dug too soon, where men and women breathed long after they were forsaken. And so, when the wind shifts over certain fields, carrying with it the odor of turned earth and decay, some say it is the breath of the pits, rising again. The lepers may be gone, their bells long silent, but their exile lingers in the soil. For in the age of faith, where every stone bore witness to Christ, there remained corners of darkness where mercy did not reach, where flesh rotted in silence, and where the outcasts waited in the mud, not for cure, not for prayer, but only for the end.